There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. For me, it happened in a ballroom in Seoul. The music was soft, glasses clinked. Men in dark suits stood along the walls pretending not to watch each other. Powerful men, dangerous men, the kind who spoke quietly because they never had to raise their voices. And at the center of the room sat Park Hyeon-je. In Seoul, people called him Hyeonjnim, some called him the Shadow King of Gangnam, but what mattered that night was simpler than that. For 12 years, the man had not stood from his wheelchair, not once, not for doctors, not for business partners, not for funerals, not for anyone. I did not know all of that when I walked toward him. I only knew that he had been watching me since I finished dancing, watching me in a way that made the room feel smaller. I remember thinking his eyes looked tired, not physically tired, soul tired, like a man who had spent a very long time carrying something heavy alone. The band began another song, slow jazz. Trumpet and piano, without fully understanding why I walked to him. Every conversation in the room seemed to fade at once. I stopped in front of him and held out my hand. "Dance with me," I said. One of the men beside him stiffened immediately. Another took half a step forward like he intended to stop me, but Park Hyeon-je lifted one hand slightly and they froze. Then he looked at me. Not angry, not surprised, just frightened. And I realized very suddenly that this man was not afraid of me. He was afraid of hope. His hands gripped the arms of the wheelchair. The room had gone completely silent now. I could hear the ice shifting in somebody's glass across the ballroom. Slowly, carefully, painfully, he pushed himself upward. At first, it looked impossible. His arms trembled violently. His shoulders tightened with effort. I remember hearing someone whisper his name under their breath, but he kept going, an inch, then another. And then, for the first time in 12 years, Park Hyeon-je stood. A woman near the back of the room began to cry. One of his men covered his mouth with both hands like he was witnessing a miracle and did not know what to do with it. And me. I stood there holding the hand of a man I barely knew, while tears rolled down my face for reasons I did not yet understand. Because that moment did not begin in that ballroom. It began 12 years earlier, with another woman, a photograph hidden in a file cabinet, and a grief so deep that one man had mistaken it for a life sentence. My name is Amara Osei. I was born in Accra, Ghana, in a neighborhood where people still sat outside in the evenings when the heat softened and the day finally loosened its grip. My grandmother cooked with the windows open. Music floated from one house to another. Nobody needed an invitation to stop and talk. Back home, life was never quiet. Even grief had company there. My grandmother used to say that people can survive almost anything if somebody says their name with love often enough. At 29 years old, I still believed that. I was a dancer. Contemporary movement mostly, though my first lessons had come long before any studio. Church halls, family celebrations, funerals, weddings. In Ghana, people teach children to dance the same way they teach them to pray or laugh. Naturally, constantly. Movement was the first language I ever trusted. When I was accepted into a cultural arts exchange program in Seoul, my entire family celebrated like I had won an Olympic medal. My mother cried in the kitchen. My grandmother prayed over me for nearly 20 minutes before I left for the airport, one hand on my forehead, one hand over my heart. "Don't forget who you are over there," she told me. I promised her I wouldn't. At the time, I believed promises were simple things. Seoul was beautiful in ways I had never imagined. The city glittered at night, neon reflected off rain-slick streets. The Han River looked silver under the bridges after dark. Even exhaustion there somehow looked elegant, but beauty and loneliness are not opposites. I learned that quickly. 3 months after I arrived, the exchange program lost its funding. Just like that, a meeting, an apology, a stamped letter. I remember staring at the paper while somebody explained budget restructuring in careful English, as if softer words could make fear smaller. My visa was still active. My rent still existed. My savings did not. My mother begged me to come home, and part of me wanted to. I missed ordinary things with an ache that surprised me. The sound of my aunties arguing in the kitchen. The smell of charcoal after rain. Mango sellers calling from the roadside, being somewhere my face made immediate sense. In Seoul, I was always aware of myself, always visible. Sometimes people stared openly, sometimes children pointed, sometimes strangers touched my hair without asking, not cruelly, not always, but enough to remind me that I was far from home. Still, I stayed, because I had spent too much of my life almost becoming the person I wanted to be, almost brave enough, almost successful enough, almost willing to risk failure. And I was tired of living like that, so I found work where I could. A performance venue in Itaewon hired me 3 nights a week. They wanted international performers for private events and cultural showcases. The money was not good, but it covered groceries and rent if I was careful. I learned how to stretch $20 into a week of meals. I learned which subway exits stayed warm during winter. I learned loneliness has a sound. It sounds like coming home to an apartment where nobody is waiting for you to speak. Most nights after performances, I would remove my makeup slowly in the dressing room because I dreaded going back to the silence. Then came the night in Gangnam, a rooftop event, private, elegant. Expensive enough that everybody pretended not to notice the security standing near the elevators. I performed for 40 minutes. The audience barely reacted, which was normal at events like that. Wealthy people often watch art the way they inspect expensive furniture, politely without surrendering themselves to it. But halfway through my performance, I felt someone watching me differently. Not casually, not politely, intently. I looked toward the back of the room, and there he was, Park Hyeon-je. Sitting perfectly still in a wheelchair, surrounded by men who watched the room like trained wolves. But he was not watching the room, he was watching me. There was something unsettling about the expression on his face. Not desire, not admiration, recognition, like he had spent years waiting for something without realizing he was waiting at all. For a moment I forgot the choreography completely. Then the music carried me forward again. When the performance ended, I left quickly. I packed my things, thanked the staff, and headed for the elevator. But just before the doors closed, I looked back. He was still watching me. And for reasons I could not explain then and barely understand now, a chill went through me so deeply it felt less like fear and more like fate finally introducing itself. In Seoul, people rarely spoke Park Hyeon-je's name loudly, not because they were forbidden to, because they were careful. Men like him create a kind of gravity around themselves. Conversations lower when they enter a room, eyes shift, people become aware of their hands, their words, their mistakes. He was 44 years old. Head of the Seongwal organization, one of the most powerful criminal networks in Seoul. His father had built it through brutality. His uncle had expanded it through politics and fear. But Hyeon-je had made it something colder, cleaner, more disciplined. He had graduated from Yonsei University with a degree in economics before most people expected him to survive the family business at all. He spoke 4 languages, read constantly. Understood finance better than half the bankers in Seoul. People said he could walk into a meeting, listen for 5 minutes, and know exactly who was lying. They also said he never forgot betrayal. I heard stories about him before I ever spoke to him. Everybody in Seoul seemed to know some version. A customs official who disappeared after stealing from the organization. A politician who publicly insulted him and spent the next decade trying unsuccessfully to rebuild his career. A rival boss who once laughed during negotiations and never laughed around Hyeon-je again. Most of the stories were probably exaggerated. That happens around powerful men, but one thing everybody agreed on was this: Park Hyeon-je never raised his voice. He did not need to. The men around him watched him with the kind of loyalty that only exists when fear and respect have lived together too long to be separated. And then there was the wheelchair. 12 years. Nobody explained it, nobody asked. It existed the same way winter exists, permanently, heavily shaping everything around it. Some people claimed he had been shot. Others whispered about a car bombing. One bartender in Itaewon told me he heard Hyeon-je had once fallen in love and lost everything afterward. People laughed at that version. Men like Park Hyeon-je were not supposed to be damaged by love. 2 weeks after the rooftop performance, a man in a dark charcoal suit arrived backstage at my venue just before my second set. He spoke quietly to the manager. I watched my manager's face change almost immediately. Fear does that to people, it drains warmth from them first. A minute later, he walked toward me holding a cream-colored envelope like it might explode. "This is for you," he said carefully. Inside was a business card, Park Hyeon-je, Gangnam address. Nothing else, and beneath it, folded neatly by hand, was a letter, not typed, handwritten. The Korean appeared first, then English beneath it in clean, deliberate script. I still remember the first line exactly. "Ms. Osei, forgive the intrusion. I realize this request is unusual." I kept reading. "I watched you dance 2 weeks ago." I had forgotten that art could still reach another human being. That line stopped me, not because it was romantic, because it sounded lonely, deeply lonely. The letter continued. "I would like to invite you to tea, no performance, no obligation. I also believe your experience would be valuable to the Seongwal Cultural Foundation, which sponsors arts programming throughout Seoul. You are welcome to verify the organization independently before responding." Then, at the very end, there are moments when something inside a person unexpectedly wakes after a long silence. Watching you dance felt like one of those moments. Park Hyeon-je, I read the letter 3 times sitting beside a rack of stage costumes while muffled music echoed through the walls outside. Most women would have thrown it away, maybe sensible women, but there was something in the letter that disturbed me precisely because it did not sound dangerous. It sounded tired. Not physically tired, spiritually tired, like a man standing at the edge of his own life unsure whether he still belonged in it. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my bag. Then I performed my second set with his words still moving through my head. The next morning, after almost an hour of arguing with myself, I called the number on the card. A man answered immediately. "Ms. Osei," he said calmly, as though he had been expecting the call. "Hyeon-je will be very pleased you accepted." The line went quiet for a moment. Then he added softly and relieved. The house surprised me. I had expected something cold, marble floors, sharp architecture. The kind of place designed to remind visitors they were standing inside another man's power. Instead, the house felt lived in, quiet, human. A woman opened the gate for me and guided me through a courtyard where winter branches moved softly in the wind. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedarwood and tea, and books everywhere. Not decorative books arranged by interior designers to impress guests. Real books, worn books, shelves crowded with pages that had been touched and reread. Korean poetry, history, African literature. Jazz biographies, philosophy. I stopped in front of a shelf when I saw Chinua Achebe beside Toni Morrison. That detail unsettled me more than the armed security outside. Who was this man? Soft trumpet music drifted through the house. Old jazz, the kind my grandfather used to play on Sunday afternoons back home while pretending to read the newspaper. One of the staff led me toward a sitting room near the back of the house, and that was when I first saw him outside the ballroom. Park Hyeon-je sat beside a large window overlooking the garden. A record player turned slowly nearby, Miles Davis. Even before I recognized the song, I recognized the feeling of it, loneliness, beautiful loneliness. He had his eyes closed when I entered. One hand rested against a teacup, the other lay motionless on the arm of the wheelchair. And for just a second, before he realized he was no longer alone, I saw something on his face no one else in Seoul probably ever saw. Grief, not dramatic grief, not cinematic grief. The quieter kind, the kind that settles into a person so completely it changes the way they breathe. Then he opened his eyes and it disappeared. The expression vanished so quickly I almost wondered if I had imagined it. He straightened slightly. "Ms. Osei," he said. His voice was lower than I expected, calm, careful. "You came?" "I almost didn't," I admitted. To my surprise, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. That was probably the wiser decision. I laughed before I could stop myself. And for the first time since arriving in Seoul, I watched a powerful man look genuinely startled by laughter. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please sit." I sat carefully, suddenly aware of everything, the music, the steam rising from the tea, the rain beginning softly against the windows. For a moment neither of us spoke. Oddly, it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like two tired people standing quietly at the edge of the same ocean. Finally, he asked, "Do you miss home very much?" It was such a simple question. Not "what do you do, where were you trained, what are your ambitions," just "do you miss home?" And something inside me softened immediately. "Yes," I said honestly. "More than I expected." He nodded once like a man who understood homesickness personally, then he looked toward the rain outside the window. "So do I," he said quietly. That was the moment everything began. Not with danger, not with power, not with the underworld, with rain against the windows. A Miles Davis record turning slowly in the corner. And two lonely people admitting very carefully that they were both far from home. The weeks that followed were professional, structured. I came to the house 3 times a week to coordinate the Seongwall Cultural Bridge Foundation's annual event. The foundation was genuine. It funded arts education in underprivileged communities across Seoul, and it did real, visible good. This was the contradiction I carried quietly. A man who operated a criminal organization and simultaneously funded children learning to paint and sing and move. The contradiction was real. I sat with it, but I was also watching him. And I was noticing things. I noticed that he read 2 hours every morning before his staff arrived. I noticed that he had strong opinions about Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and had read them with the same seriousness he brought to Korean poetry. I noticed that when he spoke, he chose words the way a musician chooses notes. Nothing wasted, nothing accidental, and I noticed the way he held his body. I want to be precise about this because it matters enormously. I had trained as a dancer for a decade. My body had become an instrument for reading other bodies. I could see the difference between a muscle that could not work and a muscle that was refusing to work. I could see the difference between paralysis and resistance. Between a body that had lost something and a body that was holding something back. The tension in Park Hyeon-je was not the tension of a man whose legs did not function. It was the tension of a man who was actively, deliberately choosing not to use them. His hands on the armrests were not the hands of a man seeking support. They were the hands of a man gripping something to stop himself from moving. I did not say anything. I filed this observation in the part of my mind where I keep things that are not yet ready to be spoken, and I kept watching. Then one afternoon I arrived early. He was in the courtyard alone before his staff had come in for the morning. He did not hear me approach. His feet were not in the chair's footrests, they were flat on the ground. And his legs, I could see this clearly, I was trained to see exactly this, his legs were engaged. The muscles of his thighs were working. He was pressing his feet into the ground the way a person does when they are thinking about standing up. He was thinking about standing, then he heard me. The feet went back. The face composed itself so rapidly it was like watching someone close every window in a house at once. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," I said. I did not speak about what I had seen. But I carried it the way I carried the letter, close, in a place where it could not be lost. Because the question was no longer * can he walk? The question was now why won't he? And I understood that the answer to that question was the answer to everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in April when I found it. I was organizing the Foundation's archival documents for a new digital database. Years of programming records, grant reports, community impact files. The oldest files from 12 years ago from the year the Foundation was first established. And inside a manila folder at the very back of the oldest cabinet I found a photograph. It was from the first Seongwal Cultural Bridge event, the inaugural event 12 years ago. I almost set it aside without looking closely, but something made me stop, something made me bring it close to the light. There were two dancers in the photograph. Standing together before the performance, laughing at something, caught in a moment of pure, unposed happiness. The woman on the left was Ghanaian, I could see it in everything. The fabric she wore, the way she carried herself, the particular joy in her face. And the woman on the right, I knew her face. I had known that face my entire life. My hands went cold. The woman on the right was my aunt, my mother's sister, Auntie Efua, who had been in Seoul 12 years ago on a cultural exchange and who had told me stories my entire childhood about that year. About a city that was overwhelming and beautiful. About a woman she had met who was extraordinary, whose name she could never say without going quiet afterward, a woman named Nadia. I turned the photograph over. On the back in small handwriting, Nadia and Efua, first Cultural Bridge event, September 12 years ago. The month Auntie Efua had always gone silent about. The month she had said only, "Something happened, Amara, that I am not ready to tell you yet." My heart was doing something I could not control. I sat on the floor of the archive room with that photograph in my hands, and I thought about a scholarship, the same cultural exchange program my aunt had been part of 12 years ago. The same program that had brought me to Seoul, the same Foundation event I was now coordinating. I thought about the Akan drum rhythm I had danced to at the Gangnam event in March. A rhythm from my grandmother's tradition, a rhythm my aunt would have carried with her to Seoul 12 years ago. And I thought about a man in a wheelchair who had watched me dance to that rhythm without once looking away. I did not know the full story yet. But I knew in the deep, cellular, unargumentable way that you sometimes simply know things, that I was not in Seoul by coincidence. I put the photograph carefully in my bag. And I went home and I called my aunt. She answered on the second ring. And when I told her what I had found, the silence on the line was so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said in a voice I had never heard from her before, "Amara, oh Amara, sit down, I have to tell you who Nadia was." Her name was Nadia Abina Mensah, Ghanaian, a dancer. 27 years old when she came to Seoul through the same cultural exchange program that later brought me there. She made people feel less alone, my aunt said quietly over the phone. Not intentionally, naturally. Some people carry warmth the way other people carry ambition. Nadia was like that. She laughed easily, loved fiercely. Danced as though music had found her before language ever did, and sometime during that year in Seoul she fell in love. With him? I asked. My aunt was silent for a moment. Yes, she never knew his full name. Only Hyeon-je, a private man, intelligent, careful, already carrying responsibilities too heavy for someone his age. But Auntie Efua had seen them together once at a cafe near the river. He looked at her, she said softly, like she had interrupted something dark inside him. Then came September. The official story was a car accident. My aunt never believed it. You know how women sometimes feel danger before they can explain it? She asked. It was like that. 3 weeks later, she returned to Ghana carrying a grief she never fully spoke aloud again. I sat in silence holding the phone against my ear. Outside my apartment window, Seoul traffic moved through the rain. Auntie, I said carefully, why didn't you ever tell me any of this? A long pause. Because I was afraid if you knew, she said, you would go looking for the rest of the story. And maybe I have, I whispered. Then I asked the question already tightening in my chest. The man Nadia loved, I said. Are you certain his name was Hyeon-je? Yes. The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. Suddenly everything connected. The scholarship, the photograph, the drum rhythm I danced the night he watched me. The letter written in careful handwriting by a man who had not felt alive in 12 years. I understood then that I had not simply wandered into Park Hyeon-je's life by accident. I had arrived carrying a memory he thought the world had buried. I kept the photograph hidden in my apartment for almost 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks I watched Hyeon-je more carefully than ever. I watched the way he avoided certain silences. The way his hands tightened against the wheelchair when conversations drifted too close to the past. The way loneliness moved through the house even when it was full of people. Then one evening, Park Hyeon-je came to my apartment. That alone frightened me. Men like Hyeon-je did not appear casually at your front door. He stepped inside, removed his gloves carefully, and looked around my small apartment with the alert calm of someone trained to notice exits before comfort. There is a man named Shin Tae-kyung, he said. He leads a rival organization in Incheon. He believes you are important to Hyeon-je. The words landed heavily. In this world, Seong-jun continued, importance becomes vulnerability. I felt cold suddenly. He has people watching you, your apartment, your movements. What does he want? I asked. To hurt Hyeon-je, he answered simply. There was no drama in his voice. Somehow that made it worse. Then he looked at me directly. I have worked beside Park Hyeon-je for 16 years, he said. I have never seen him care whether he lived or died until now. The room went still. And that, Seong-jun said quietly, makes you dangerous to him. After he left, I sat alone for a long time staring at the photograph of Nadia and my aunt. I opened my laptop. Pulled up flights to Accra, hovered over the purchase button. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, go home. Return to sunlight and familiar voices, and a world where powerful men did not destroy the people they loved. But I kept thinking about Hyeon-je standing in the courtyard early in the morning, pressing his feet against the ground when he believed nobody could see him trying. Finally, I closed the laptop. Then I called him. I told him everything Seong-jun had said. There was a long silence. Finally, I will handle it, he said quietly. I don't want it handled, I replied. I want the truth. Should I be afraid? Another silence. Yes, he said. At least he respected me enough not to lie. I tightened my grip on the phone. Then answer one more question honestly, I said. Did you know a woman named Nadia Abina Mensah? The silence that followed felt endless. Then I heard him inhale sharply. Where did you hear that name? His voice had changed completely. I told him about the photograph, about my aunt, about the exchange program 12 years ago. When I finished speaking, he said only, come to the house. Not cold, not commanding, almost fragile. I'm already leaving, I said. The house was silent when I arrived. No music, no records spinning softly in the library. Even the staff moved more quietly than usual, as though grief itself had returned to the building. Hyeon-je was waiting for me in the library holding the photograph. He stared at it for so long before speaking that I wondered if he had forgotten I was there. Nadia, he said finally, very softly, like a prayer or an apology. Then, slowly, he told me everything. He told me about meeting her at a rehearsal studio in Mapogu, about how she laughed when he tried to learn Akan rhythms and failed so badly she nearly fell to the floor laughing at him. About late-night walks along the Han River, about falling in love despite knowing his world destroyed gentle things. She made me forget who I was, he said quietly. And for a while I wanted to, then his face changed. September. Even now, 12 years later, the month itself seemed painful for him to say aloud. They told me it was a car accident, he said. But I knew immediately what it really was. A message. Someone had decided the fastest way to wound Park Hyeon-je was through the woman he loved. Rain struck the library windows hard enough to make me flinch. She died because of me, he said, not dramatically, just as fact. He told me about the funeral. About standing beside her grave, unable to understand how the world could continue moving normally while she no longer existed inside it. And afterward, I asked gently. His eyes lowered toward the wheelchair. Afterward, he said, I sat down, not because his body failed, because grief convinced him movement itself was betrayal. For 12 years he had lived inside that decision. The library stayed quiet except for the rain. Then I spoke carefully. In Akan tradition, Abina means a girl born on Tuesday, I said. A person born with purpose. He looked at me tiredly. I think you turned her death into a punishment, I said softly, but maybe loving her was supposed to make you more human. Not destroy you. His eyes closed briefly. You sound like her, he whispered. I shook my head. No, I said. I think she simply loved the part of you that was still capable of being reached. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked at the photograph again. And for the first time since I had known him, Park Hyeon-je no longer looked like a man surviving grief. He looked like a man wondering if surviving was the same thing as living. The Seongwal Cultural Bridge annual event was held on a Saturday evening in late June in a grand hotel ballroom in Gangnam. Seoul had turned warm. The night air was soft, carrying the smell of the Han River on a light breeze. I had built the program over months. Korean traditional arts and West African performance not as comparison, not as competition, but as conversation. The kind that happens when two very different things that both contain enormous beauty sit together and listen to each other. The room was full. Foundation donors, cultural figures, community members. And along the walls in impeccable suits, the men with careful eyes who were always present when Park Hyeon-je was in a room. He was there, on the raised platform, his usual composed presence. Receiving gratitude with stillness, but tonight something was different. Tonight he was not watching the room, he was watching me, the way you watch something you have already made a decision about. The way you watch something you have chosen. I knew what I was going to do that night. I had known since the archive room, since the photograph, since the phone call with my aunt, since the rainy library evening when he had told me everything. I had carried it as a certainty for weeks, the way you carry something that you know will either heal everything or break everything, and you understand that either way it has to happen. After the performances, after the speeches, after the room had settled into the warm social movement of a late evening, the jazz ensemble shifted to something slower, something aching and warm. Couples moved to the floor. I was standing near the edge. I thought about Nadia Abina Mensa. I thought about a Tuesday-born woman who had come with purpose. I thought about 12 years of feet refusing to touch the ground. I thought about my aunt's voice and a photograph at the back of a cabinet and a drum rhythm played on a Gangnam rooftop. I thought about everything that had been building toward this room. I turned, I walked to the platform. He looked up at me, the armor was still in place. But in his eyes was everything the armor was trying to contain. I extended my hand, and I said it, dance with me. I said it softly. But in that ballroom the words seemed to travel everywhere at once. Conversations stopped, glasses lowered, even the musicians looked up for half a second before continuing the song. I stood in front of Park Hyeon-je with my hand extended between us, and suddenly I understood something I had not fully understood before. This was not about whether he could stand. It was about whether he believed he deserved to. He looked at my hand for a long moment, then he looked at me. There was fear in his face, not fear of falling, fear of returning. Amara, he said quietly, just my name, but the way he said it made my chest ache. I took one small step closer. You loved her, I said, a muscle tightened in his jaw. And after she died, you punished yourself for surviving. The room had become so quiet I could hear the soft hiss of rain against the ballroom windows. I kept my voice gentle. But I don't think she would want this for you. His eyes closed briefly. You didn't know Nadia, he said. No, I answered, but I know what grief looks like when it turns into guilt. And I know what loneliness looks like when someone has lived inside it too long. His hands tightened on the wheelchair arms. I lowered my voice even more. She loved a man who could still laugh. A man who listened to jazz records and learned African drum rhythms even though he had no talent for either one. A faint smile touched my face. I think she would be furious if she saw what you've done to him. Something in his expression broke at that, not dramatically, quietly, the way ice breaks at the beginning of spring. Behind him, one of his men shifted nervously. Hyeon-je lifted one hand slightly without looking away from me. The man immediately fell silent. Then Hyeon-je looked back at my outstretched hand. For one terrible second, I thought he would refuse, that he would retreat into the safety of stillness again. But instead, very slowly, he placed his hand in mine. Warm, shaking, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, then he pushed against the chair. At first, almost nothing happened. I saw frustration flash across his face immediately, 12 years of fear and weakness and memory rising all at once. His arms trembled violently. The cane beside the chair clattered softly to the floor, and still he pushed. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Nobody had ever seen this before, not his staff, not his men. Not even the people closest to him. For 12 years, Park Hyeon-je had remained seated through every meeting, every negotiation, every funeral, every triumph. Now his body shook with the effort of trying to reclaim something grief had stolen from him long ago. Halfway up, he faltered. I moved closer instinctively. You don't have to do it perfectly, I whispered. His breathing was ragged now. I could feel the fear in him, not fear of pain, fear of hope. Fear that if he stood, he would have to begin living again. And living again after loss is terrifying. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and something changed. Maybe it was trust. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe simply the realization that he did not want to spend the rest of his life sitting inside a grave he had built for himself. Whatever it was, it carried him the rest of the way. Slowly, trembling visibly, Park Hyeon-je stood. A woman near the back of the ballroom covered her mouth and began crying openly. Park Hyeon-je looked like a man witnessing something sacred and frightening at the same time, and Hyeon-je. He stood there staring at me with tears running freely down his face, no longer making the slightest effort to hide them. For years, those tears had belonged to a man alone. Now they belonged to someone returning to the world. I squeezed his hand gently. "You're here," I said. He let out a shaky breath. "Yes," he whispered. The jazz band continued softly in the background. Trumpet, piano, brushes against drums, life continuing. Carefully, uncertainly, he took one step toward me, then another. The ballroom remained completely silent, except for the music and the uneven sound of his breathing. And there, in the center of that enormous room filled with dangerous men and expensive suits and years of fear, we danced. Not beautifully, not gracefully, but honestly. His legs trembled. My eyes burned with tears. At one point he laughed unexpectedly through the crying, almost embarrassed by how difficult something so simple had become, and I laughed too. Because suddenly it did not feel tragic anymore. It felt human. That was the miracle, not that a man stood from a wheelchair. But that after 12 years of grief, he finally allowed himself to be alive again. People think healing arrives all at once. It doesn't. Healing is usually quiet, repetitive. Sometimes unbearably slow. The threats surrounding Hyeon-je's organization did not magically disappear after the ballroom that night. Men like Shin Tae-kyung did not become less dangerous simply because someone found hope again. There were still meetings behind closed doors, still security cars outside the house. Still nights when Seong-jun returned with exhaustion written across his face and said very little over dinner. That world remained what it had always been. But inside the house, something had changed permanently. 3 mornings after the ballroom, Hyeon-je began physical therapy, not publicly, not dramatically. At 6 every morning, a doctor arrived through the side entrance carrying a black medical bag, and the patient calm of someone who understood recovery could not be rushed. The first session lasted 23 minutes. I know because afterward I found Hyeon-je sitting alone in the kitchen, staring into a cup of untouched tea while sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. He looked exhausted, not weak, just exhausted in the honest way people become when they are fighting their way back toward themselves. "You should rest," I told him gently. He gave a tired smile. "If I stop now," he said, "I might lose my nerve." So he kept going. Every morning, some days he walked farther, some days he barely managed the length of the hallway. Some days the pain frustrated him enough that silence settled over the house like weather, but he kept going. And slowly, almost invisibly, life began returning to him in ordinary ways. One afternoon, I heard him humming along to a jazz record while reading in the library. Another morning, I found him standing at the kitchen counter making his own tea, because he was determined to stop relying on everyone else for simple things. The first time he walked into the garden without the wheelchair, 2 members of his staff quietly pretended not to cry. None of us mentioned it. That was the kindness of the house by then. We let victories arrive without embarrassing them. At night, after the staff had gone to sleep, we would sometimes sit together in the kitchen listening to old records spin softly in the dark. Miles Davis, Ebo Taylor, Nina Simone, sometimes we talked, sometimes we didn't. By then, silence between us no longer felt lonely, it felt earned. One evening he looked at me over the rim of his teacup and said, "I wasted 12 years. I shook my head immediately. "No," I said, "you survived 12 years. He looked down for a moment. Then very quietly, "There's a difference." "Yes," I said, "one is surrender, the other is endurance." He was silent after that, not because he disagreed. Because he was thinking about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he deserved kindness too. And watching that realization slowly happen inside another human being was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. He came to find me in the garden in October. He stood at the edge of the garden path with his careful face doing something complicated. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't owe me anything," I said. "I came to your apartment to remove you from his life," he said. "I want to acknowledge that directly. I assessed you as a danger and I tried to eliminate the danger." He paused. "I was wrong about what kind of danger you were. You were dangerous to everything that was keeping him from living. That is a different kind of danger entirely." He looked at me steadily. "I have worked for Park Hyeon-je for 16 years, he said. "I have never once in 16 years seen him at peace. Not a version of it, not a glimpse of it." He paused. I watched him stand in that ballroom, and I understood something I had not understood before. That the thing I was protecting him from was the thing that was going to bring him back. He gave a short, formal bow. I stood and returned it. "Mr. Beek," I said. "Is he going to be okay?" He considered the question with genuine seriousness. "He is going to try," he said. For the first time in 12 years, he is going to try. That is more than I thought I would ever see. He walked back toward the house, and I understood that something had moved in the world around Hyeon-je, not just in him, small, fragile, but real. By December, Seoul had settled into winter. The trees along the Han River stood bare against the pale sky, and the wind coming off the water carried the sharp, clean cold that makes people walk a little closer together without realizing it. That afternoon, Hyeon-je and I walked slowly along the riverfront. He used a cane now, not always. Some days were better than others, but he no longer hid the effort it took. That more than anything told me how much he had changed. Months earlier, he would rather have suffered privately than let anyone see weakness. Now he simply paused when he needed to pause. There is dignity in that kind of honesty. Older people understand this instinctively. The body changes. Pride survives longer than strength. Learning to accept help without feeling diminished is its own kind of courage. We walked in silence for a while, not empty silence, comfortable silence. The kind that only arrives after two people have stopped trying to impress each other. A man rode past us on a bicycle ringing a small bell. Somewhere behind us, a child laughed. The river moved steadily beside the path, gray and endless beneath the winter light. Then Hyeon-je stopped walking. He rested both hands on the top of the cane and looked out across the water. "I want to see Accra," he said. I smiled slightly. "You say that like it's a small trip." "I don't think it will be," he answered. There was something careful in his voice, not fear exactly, respect. "I want to meet your grandmother," he continued, "and your mother, your aunts." He glanced at me briefly. "I would like to understand the people who taught you how to stay soft without becoming weak." The words caught me off guard, not because they were romantic, because they were sincere. That was the thing about Hyeon-je. When he finally chose to say something honest, it arrived without performance. I laughed quietly. "My grandmother is going to interrogate you," I warned him. "She will do it politely, but make no mistake, it will be an interrogation." For the first time in months, I heard him laugh without restraint. A real laugh, warm, unexpected, young almost. "What happens after the interrogation?" he asked. "If she likes you, she'll feed you until you can't stand up." He looked down at the cane in his hand. "Well," he said dryly, "let's hope I'm stronger by then." I laughed harder this time, enough that a few people walking past glanced toward us. And suddenly I realized something that almost brought tears to my eyes. When I first met him, Park Hyeon-je carried silence like armor. Now, standing beside me by the river, he sounded like a man beginning to believe he might still have a future. Not just survival, a future. He reached for my hand then, almost cautiously, as though some part of him still could not believe he was allowed to want ordinary happiness. I held his hand tightly. The winter wind moved around us. Cars crossed the bridge overhead. The river kept flowing south toward places neither of us could see from where we stood, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. We did not need to. Because after everything that had happened, the grief, the fear, the years he had lost sitting motionless inside his own sorrow, this was the miracle, not that he had stood in the ballroom. Not even that he had danced, it was this. A cold afternoon, a slow walk beside the river, two tired people holding hands without fear. Peace rarely arrives dramatically. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, like winter light on water, like laughter returning when you thought it was gone forever, like a man who once gave up on life making plans for next summer. I want to tell you the last thing, the simple thing. I used to think healing was something that happened to you, a process you submitted to. One day you woke up lighter and that was it. But that is not what I watched happen in Park Hyeon-je. What I watched was a man who had made an agreement with his own grief, who had said, "I will hold perfectly still, I will not rise. My stillness is what she deserves from me." And his body, which had learned to trust what his heart decided, had kept that agreement faithfully for 12 years, until the agreement became too costly. Until something arrived that made staying still more painful than moving forward. That is the thing I want you to carry from this story. Love is not the absence of grief. Love is not the solution to loss. Love is the moment when the cost of remaining absent from your own life becomes greater than the fear of returning to it. And sometimes you need someone to stand in front of you with their hand extended and say, "I know it has been a long time, I know it is hard, stand up anyway." He stood because I asked him to dance. But really, he stood because Nadia Abina Mensah had come to this city 12 years ago with a Tuesday-born woman's purpose and intention. And that purpose had been patient enough to wait for the right thread to pull. To travel through my aunt's grief and my grandmother's prayers and a scholarship and a photograph and a drum rhythm and a letter written in careful handwriting, all the way to one room, one evening. One extended hand. She sent me, I believe that with everything in me, and he danced with me that night with trembling legs and tears on his face and the whole world watching. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, not because it was perfect, because it was true. Because it was a man who had given up on the right to be alive, choosing slowly, painfully in front of everyone to come back. My grandmother says, the river does not push the stone. It simply keeps moving around it until the stone decides to give way. She is always right, and sometimes the stone stands up and asks you to dance. The heart heals in its own time. And when it does, the body finally remembers how to follow. Thank you for listening to this story. If it meant something to you, there's more like it here. You're always welcome to come back for more.